The hospital buzzes with the steady hum of a busy day. Nurses and doctors move quickly but efficiently through the sterile, bright corridors, the air filled with the soft beep of monitors and the distant murmur of medical chatter. This is a place of precision, a prestigious hospital known for its elite status and the seamless integration of technology and expertise. Dr. Maya Carter walks calmly through the flurry of activity, dressed in her nurse uniform. She moves with the quiet confidence of someone who knows every corner of this building, someone who holds everything together. Her demeanor is poised, her gestures minimal yet full of control. The staff greet her with quick nods, a flash of recognition in their eyes. They know who she is, and they respect her. Maya approaches a group of nurses, quickly organizing the treatment plan for a difficult case. She speaks softly, but with authority, offering advice, giving instructions, and then stepping back, letting them execute the plan. There's no need for grand gestures or drawn-out explanations. Her presence alone keeps things running smoothly. She glances down at the chart of an incoming patient, mentally mapping out the next steps. As she does, a junior doctor hesitates nearby, unsure of the best course of action. Maya notices, offers a brief, encouraging nod, and suggests a method. The doctor quickly takes her suggestion and moves on, grateful for the help. Maya watches for a moment, her face impassive but focused. What isn't immediately apparent to everyone in the hospital, especially to newcomers, is that Maya is far more than a nurse. She is the medical director, the very person responsible for overseeing the operations and decision-making within these walls. Her nameplate on the office door subtly hints at her authority, but she wears it lightly. She prefers to work quietly, letting her actions speak louder than her title. As the hospital continues its day, a sleek black car pulls up in front of the entrance. Out steps Dr. Richard Thompson. His shoes click on the floor as he enters the building, carrying himself with a sense of pride and self-importance. He's fresh out of a prestigious medical school, handpicked for this hospital, and he knows it. His reputation for brilliance follows him, but so does his arrogance. Richard walks through the corridors, casting quick glances at the staff. He makes snap judgments, sizing people up in seconds, mentally ranking them based on what he sees. In his mind, the hierarchy is clear, and he's already near the top. As he strides confidently through the hospital, his eyes land on Maya. He watches her briefly, noticing how other doctors and nurses seem to defer to her. She's in a nurse's uniform, and to him, that's all he needs to know. He dismisses her instantly, not seeing the quiet authority she holds, just another nurse in his world. He's polite, but there's a patronizing undertone in his interactions, a subtle condescension that lingers in his voice. Maya, for her part, remains unbothered, continuing her work without acknowledging the assumptions being made about her. She's been here long enough to recognize this attitude, to see the confidence of someone who believes they know everything. But she doesn't correct him or call attention to herself. There's no need. As Richard continues his rounds, he notices Maya again, this time giving instructions to another doctor. The doctor listens closely, nodding in agreement before heading off to carry out her suggestions. Richard frowns, watching the exchange with growing irritation. He doesn't understand why a nurse is giving orders. He doesn't know that Maya's position far exceeds what her uniform might suggest. To him, it feels wrong, out of place, and the unease grows in him. He walks away, dismissing Maya entirely in his mind. Just a nurse, he mutters under his breath, feeling confident in his assessment. The tension in the air is subtle, almost invisible, but it's there. Richard's ignorance and bias clash silently with the reality of Maya's role, laying the groundwork for the conflict that is to come. The hospital hums along as usual, the routines in place, but beneath the surface, the dynamics are shifting. Power is not always what it seems, and appearances, as Richard will soon learn, can be deceiving. The emergency room is in chaos. Multiple patients are rushed in at once, a car accident on the freeway has led to severe injuries, and the staff is overwhelmed. Nurses and doctors scramble to stabilize the situation, moving from one critical patient to another with urgency. Maya is in the middle of it all, effortlessly coordinating the teams. She's calm, directing staff, and issuing instructions, her experience evident in the way she navigates the crisis. Her voice is steady, her commands precise, ensuring that no detail is missed despite the frantic energy around her. Richard stands nearby, watching her as she gives detailed medical advice to a doctor working on a particularly complex case. She instructs the team on how to handle a tricky intubation, giving specific recommendations about the patient's breathing patterns. This catches Richard's attention, and not in a good way. His eyes narrow as he listens to her. In his mind, she's clearly overstepping, offering medical advice that should be coming from him or another doctor. His annoyance grows with each word she says. Who does she think she is? He thinks to himself, his inner frustration bubbling up. She's a nurse. She should be managing basic care, not dictating the medical course of action. His resentment festers, the sight of her commanding the room starting to feel personal. He believes that her confidence, her ease in these moments, is misplaced, an overreach that challenges the natural order of things in his mind. As the situation intensifies, a patient crashes. Alarms sound, and the room becomes even more frantic. Maya steps in once again, calmly taking charge. We need to increase the dosage, she says, quickly directing the nurse to adjust the medication. Her instructions are clear and confident, the kind that comes from years of experience. But Richard can't take it anymore. In the middle of her instruction, he interrupts her, his voice cutting through the noise of the emergency room. What are you doing? He says, his tone sharp, accusatory. Everyone pauses for a split second, their heads turning toward him. You're not a doctor, he continues, his voice growing louder. You shouldn't be making decisions like this. The room goes silent, all eyes shifting from Richard to Maya. The staff exchange uneasy glances, the tension thick in the air. Some of them know exactly who Maya is, while others simply feel the discomfort of seeing someone publicly called out in such an aggressive manner. Richard, emboldened by the silence, steps closer, his voice rising. This is not your job, he says, pointing at her as if emphasizing her inferiority. You should stick to nursing and leave the medical decisions to those of us qualified to make them. His words are laced with condescension, dripping with the assumption that Maya is out of her depth, that she's overstepping the natural hierarchy. Maya stands there, her expression calm but her eyes betraying the hurt that lingers just beneath the surface. She doesn't flinch, doesn't lash back. Instead, she holds her ground, her composure unshaken despite the verbal assault. Her silence speaks volumes, a quiet strength that only frustrates Richard more. He expects her to react, to argue, or at least back down, but she does none of those things. She simply stands, allowing the weight of his words to settle around them. The rest of the medical team remains frozen, unsure of how to respond. They know Maya's authority, but they also feel the power imbalance between her and Richard. Some glance toward the senior doctor in the room, hoping for intervention, while others shift uncomfortably, waiting for the tension to break. Richard, seeing Maya's lack of reaction, pushes further. This is exactly why nurses shouldn't try to play doctor, he says, his tone dripping with superiority. You're putting patients at risk by making decisions you're not qualified to make. The room seems to tighten around them, the air thick with unspoken tension. Finally, another senior doctor steps in, diffusing the situation with a brief, firm statement. Let's focus on the patient, he says, his voice cutting through the hostility. The team resumes their work, but the damage is already done. The weight of Richard's words hangs heavy in the air, the discomfort palpable. Maya, still composed, returns to her duties without a word. She doesn't retaliate, doesn't seek validation or sympathy. Her professionalism remains intact, but the sting of the moment is undeniable. The staff around her are left uneasy, many of them aware of the truth, that Maya is not just a nurse, but the medical director. Yet no one speaks up. Richard, on the other hand, feels vindicated. In his mind, he's done the right thing, putting someone in their place, before a mistake could be made. He walks away from the encounter confident that he's asserted the correct hierarchy, oblivious to the deeper dynamics at play. To him, this is how things should be, doctors making decisions, nurses following orders. But as the day continues, the dramatic irony deepens. The audience knows what Richard doesn't, that Maya's authority far exceeds what he's assumed. That the very person he humiliated is far more qualified than he'll ever understand. The hospital continues its routine, but beneath the surface, the stage is set for the inevitable confrontation. The conference room is quiet, the soft shuffle of papers and murmured greetings filling the air as the senior staff and hospital board members take their seats. Maya enters the room with the same quiet composure she carries everywhere, her presence commanding without effort. Today's meeting is routine, departmental updates, discussions on hospital performance, and future planning. Richard sits near the end of the table, completely unaware that this meeting is about to shift his entire perspective. He notices Maya entering, but gives her little thought. To him, she's just part of the staff, here to offer logistical updates. His mind is still riding the satisfaction of putting her in her place earlier. As the chief medical officer begins the meeting, Richard settles in, expecting a regular briefing. The CMO clears his throat, glancing over his notes before speaking. "Before we begin," he says, "I'd like to introduce Dr. Maya Carter, our medical director. She'll be leading today's discussion on performance and the latest operational challenges." Richard's head snaps up, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. For a moment, he's convinced he's misheard. Dr. Maya Carter? Medical director? The words don't compute. The nurse he publicly humiliated earlier today is the medical director? His superior? Maya, calm and collected, steps up to the front of the room, completely unfazed. The quiet power she exudes now carries an entirely different weight. She stands at the head of the table, the same place Richard assumed he should be commanding from, only now it's clear she's been in control the whole time. Richard feels the blood drain from his face. His internal world is spinning, trying to reconcile the arrogant assumptions he made with the reality in front of him. His mind races back to every moment in the ER earlier that day, every word he hurled at her, every sneer, every dismissive comment. He humiliated her in front of the entire team, believing he was putting a nurse in her place, but in fact, he had belittled his own boss, a woman with more authority and experience than he could have imagined. The silence in the room is heavy, everyone aware of the dynamic shift. Those who knew of Maya's true status glance at Richard, waiting for his reaction. The tension lingers, but Maya pays it no mind. She opens her folder, the picture of professionalism, and begins her presentation without so much as a glance in Richard's direction. She speaks confidently, clearly outlining the hospital's recent performance, the upcoming challenges, and her strategy for improvement. Every word is precise, deliberate, backed by years of experience and knowledge. Richard, meanwhile, is frozen, a knot of regret and shame tightening in his chest. His internal monologue is a swirl of disbelief and self-loathing. How could he have been so blind? So arrogant? He remembers every judgment he made about her, every assumption he allowed to guide his behavior. The shame burns in his throat. He knows he can't take back what he said, and the fact that Maya hasn't mentioned it, hasn't even acknowledged it, only deepens his sense of humiliation. As Maya speaks, there's a quiet shift in the room. Those who hadn't known her full title now understand her true authority. And in that moment something else becomes clear, the biases that had been at play all along. The assumptions about Maya, based on her appearance and her position in Scrubs, had led to a gross underestimation of her capabilities. Richard isn't the only one guilty of it, and as she continues her presentation, the weight of that systemic issue presses on everyone in the room. But Maya doesn't address it. She doesn't need to. Her mere presence, her calm leadership, and her complete disregard for the earlier insults speak louder than any direct confrontation could. The power of her restraint is undeniable. By not lowering herself to Richard's level, by not acknowledging the humiliation he tried to inflict on her, she maintains her dignity and stands as a stark contrast to his earlier behavior. Richard sits, feeling smaller and smaller with each passing moment. His internal voice nags at him, telling him to apologize, to say something, anything, that might undo the damage he's caused. But he knows that now, in this setting, it's too late. An apology would feel hollow, and any attempt to justify his actions would only make things worse. As Maya wraps up her presentation, she opens the floor for questions. A few hands go up, and she responds with the same quiet confidence she's maintained throughout. Not once does she falter, not once does she give Richard a second thought. And that, perhaps, is the most painful part for him. He had seen himself as powerful, as someone to be respected and feared, but here, in this room, it is Maya who holds all the cards. It is Maya who has the respect of the room, and she has earned it not through arrogance, but through grace, knowledge, and a steady hand. As the meeting concludes, the room begins to clear, but the tension lingers between Richard and Maya. He knows he must face her eventually, must acknowledge what he's done, but the weight of his own actions feels suffocating. Maya collects her things, turning to leave without so much as a glance in his direction. The silence between them is deafening, the realization of his own deep-seated biases now crashing over him. And as she walks out, head held high, it is Richard who is left sitting in the quiet aftermath of his own humiliation, the true lesson of the day finally sinking in. Richard sits alone in his office, staring blankly at the stack of paperwork in front of him. His hands rest motionless on the desk, but his mind is anything but still. The events of the day loop endlessly in his head, every word he spoke, every glance exchanged, every moment of silence that followed. His stomach twists as he remembers how confidently he had humiliated Maya, believing himself to be in the right. Now, in the solitude of his office, Richard begins to confront the uncomfortable truth about what really happened. It wasn't just a misunderstanding about roles or hierarchy. It wasn't Maya overstepping, as he had told himself. No, it was him, his own arrogance, his blind assumptions. His mind churns with memories of the judgments he had made, not just in that one instance, but over the course of his entire career. Every time he looked at someone like Maya, a black woman in a nurse's uniform, and instinctively placed her in a box, he never considered who they truly were or what they might be capable of. For the first time, Richard sees the raw ugliness of his assumptions. He hadn't questioned whether Maya was competent, whether she knew what she was doing. He simply decided she wasn't because of how she looked, because she didn't fit his image of who should hold authority in a hospital. His privilege had blinded him, allowed him to believe that power was his birthright, that his position and success were inevitable. As this self-awareness settles in, Richard feels a growing sense of shame. It's not just about the incident earlier today, it's about his entire approach to people. He realizes now how often he's operated from a place of unspoken entitlement, how little he's questioned the biases that have shaped his worldview. He sits there, wrestling with the uncomfortable realization that he's been complicit in the very systems he's supposed to fight against as a doctor, someone who's sworn to care for all people equally. Needing more perspective, Richard decides to reach out to one of his colleagues, Dr. Patel, someone who has been at the hospital for years and has worked closely with Maya. He finds Dr. Patel in the break room, going over charts. There's a hesitation in Richard's voice as he approaches, but his need for answers pushes him forward. "Can I ask you something?" Richard says, trying to keep his tone casual. "You've worked with Dr. Carter for a while, right?" Dr. Patel looks up, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Yes, I have." "Why?" Richard pauses, unsure how to phrase the question. "I didn't realize she was the medical director until today. I guess I just assumed." He trails off, feeling the weight of his own ignorance hang in the air. Dr. Patel nods, a knowing look in his eyes. "You wouldn't be the first to make that mistake. Maya doesn't flaunt her title. She never has. She's always been more focused on the work than the recognition." There's a silence between them before Richard asks, more quietly, "What's her story? How did she get here?" Dr. Patel leans back in his chair, his expression softening as he reflects. "Maya's been through a lot. She started as a nurse, just like you saw today, but she was always meant for more. She put herself through medical school while working double shifts. Faced plenty of barriers along the way, too, some of them blatant, others more subtle. A lot of people couldn't see past her skin color or her gender. But she never let it stop her. She worked harder than anyone I've ever seen. Richard listens intently, each word from Dr. Patel making him feel smaller. The more he learns about Maya's journey, the more foolish his earlier behavior seems. He realizes that he had reduced Maya to a stereotype, assumed things about her without ever once considering her background, her struggles, or her triumphs. She's always been one of the best. Dr. Patel continues. She's saved countless lives, built this hospital's emergency response system from the ground up, and earned the respect of everyone here. But she's never asked for special treatment. She just does the work. Richard shifts uncomfortably, guilt settling in his gut like a heavy stone. He had belittled someone who had more experience, more grit, and more knowledge than he'd ever realized. His mind flashes back to the meeting, to the poised, calm way Maya had spoken, never once mentioning his insult, never seeking to humiliate him in return. Her restraint now felt like a mirror reflecting back his own inadequacies. Dr. Patel senses the change in Richard's demeanor. Something happened between you two? Richard hesitates, then admits. I made a fool of myself. In front of everyone. I didn't know who she was and assumed she was just a nurse. I questioned her authority. I humiliated her. Dr. Patel lets out a slow breath, nodding slowly. Maya's not one to hold grudges. But that doesn't mean she wasn't hurt by it. Richard swallows hard, the weight of his actions bearing down on him more than ever. He doesn't know how to fix what he's done, doesn't know how to approach Maya now. An apology seems inadequate. How do you say sorry for something as deep as this? How do you apologize for not just one moment, but for a lifetime of assumptions? He thanks Dr. Patel and leaves, returning to his office, but the internal struggle continues. The Richard who walked into that hospital this morning is not the same Richard sitting in his chair now. For the first time, he sees himself with the clarity that Maya's silence forced upon him. His privilege, his entitlement, his unconscious biases, they're all laid bare. Richard knows he has to make things right, but the question of how still looms large. A simple apology won't undo the harm he's done, won't erase the years of dismissiveness and arrogance. But he realizes that confronting his biases is the first step in a much longer process of change. Richard finds Maya alone in a quiet corner of the hospital, away from the chaotic rhythm of the day. He hesitates, his heart heavy with the weight of his mistakes. For a moment, he considers turning back, avoiding this confrontation altogether. But the shame and guilt have gnawed at him long enough. He takes a deep breath and steps forward. Maya, he begins, his voice low but steady. She looks up from her work, her expression unreadable, but she gives him her attention. The silence hangs between them as he searches for the right words. I owe you an apology, Richard says, the words feeling almost inadequate as they leave his mouth. For what I said, for how I treated you in front of everyone. I was completely out of line. I made assumptions about you that were wrong, and there's no excuse for it. Maya listens, her gaze steady, but she doesn't respond immediately. Richard pushes on, feeling the need to be completely honest. I know it wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was prejudice. I didn't see you for who you are, I saw what I wanted to see. I've been so blind to my own biases, and I'm sorry for that. Truly. There's a pause as Maya absorbs his words. When she finally speaks, her voice is calm but firm. I appreciate the apology, Richard. But this isn't just about you and me. What happened in that ER happens all the time, to people like me, in places like this. You're not the first to judge me because of how I look or the position I hold, and sadly, you won't be the last. Richard's face tightens, the sting of her words cutting deeper because he knows they're true. I know, he says quietly. I see that now. Maya continues, her tone unwavering. It's not enough to recognize your biases after the fact. You have to actively work against them, every day. This field is filled with people who have the knowledge and the skills, but because of how they look, they're constantly underestimated. And that doesn't just hurt the individuals, it hurts patients, the quality of care, and the entire profession. Richard nods, his throat tight with emotion. You're right, he admits. I have a lot to learn. And I want to do better. I want to help change this. Maya softens slightly, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. Change doesn't happen overnight, Richard. It takes work, real work. It means confronting uncomfortable truths, and not just about yourself, but about the systems we're part of. Richard listens, humbled. He's never heard it put so plainly before, but now it all makes sense. This wasn't just about fixing his own behavior. It was about addressing the larger, more insidious problem of bias and inequality woven into the fabric of the healthcare system. In the days and weeks that follow, Richard takes Maya's words to heart. He begins by attending diversity and bias training sessions that the hospital board, with Maya's guidance, starts implementing. The sessions are intense, forcing him to confront not only his own biases but also the ways in which the medical field as a whole perpetuates inequality. Maya, ever the leader, spearheads these efforts, pushing for more inclusive policies and practices within the hospital. She works tirelessly with the board to ensure that these changes aren't just performative, but meaningful. Under her leadership, the hospital begins to roll out a comprehensive initiative aimed at creating a more inclusive work culture, one where people are judged on their merit, not their appearance. Richard, no longer on the defensive, embraces the discomfort of growth. He realizes that change starts with listening, really listening, to the experiences of those who've been marginalized. He joins the diversity task force and becomes an advocate for these initiatives, understanding that his privilege gives him a responsibility to help dismantle the very systems that once worked in his favor. Maya, meanwhile, fully steps into her role as a leader, not just in title, but in action. She becomes a mentor to the younger nurses and doctors, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds. Her story inspires them, not just because of what she's accomplished, but because of how she's carried herself with dignity, even in the face of prejudice. She holds workshops and talks about the importance of empathy and equality in healthcare. Maya pushes the message that good healthcare isn't just about the science, it's about treating every patient and every colleague with the respect and fairness they deserve. Her influence ripples through the hospital, changing the way people see each other and themselves. Richard watches this transformation, both in himself and in the institution he's been a part of for so long. The uncomfortable truths he once ignored are now front and center, and instead of running from them, he faces them head on. The hospital culture begins to shift, slowly but surely. There's more openness, more willingness to question assumptions, and a growing commitment to making the workplace a truly equitable space. As the weeks turn into months, the tension that once defined Richard and Maya's relationship gives way to a quiet understanding. They're not friends, exactly, but there's a mutual respect between them now. Richard knows he still has a long way to go, but he's committed to the journey. In the end, it's not just about Richard's redemption, it's about the possibility of a better future for everyone in the hospital. A future where people like Maya aren't just tolerated, but celebrated for their skills and contributions. Where the next generation of healthcare workers will come into a world that is more just, more equal, and more aware of the biases that have held so many back. Maya stands at the helm of that future, her influence shaping the hospital into a place where everyone can thrive, regardless of who they are or what they look like. And as Richard continues to learn and grow, he realizes that real change isn't just about making amends, it's about making things better for those who come after.